And we're in. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Escaping the Echo Chamber, the podcast where bold conversations break through the noise. And we are here to dive into the big ideas, diverse perspectives, and stories that genuinely challenge the echo chamber. So this week we have our guest, Luca Mani, founder of SapienX, and advocate for the post-HR generation. But as always, with me in the co-host seat is my co-host Matthias, Talent 100 2024 awardee.
Can you believe it? It's real.
I can. But Matthias, tee up this week's kind of conversation for us, because we spoke to Sunita previously. This is kind of expanding on that kind of echo chamber. So what is Luke here to help us escape?
Yeah, more than happy to. Hi, everyone. I think for us it's really important. We've been told by lots of other different sources in the industry that we need to redesign, reimagine HR and people practices these days because, of AI or because of, that the companies change or environments and situations change. And the question is, do we really need to change something? It goes down for all the TA friends in the room. Every time we talk about recruitment is broken, and then people maybe say HR is broken, right? So, or people topics are broken. And so that's why we need to reimagine and redesign. And is this really the case? I would love to spend a lot of time today about this topic and really understanding, is it broken, is it not broken, what could be causes why people say that, but also what are actually advice or recommendations to say, no, stick to what we have, because literally it's maybe your lack of knowledge that drives you to redesign these practices.
Before we get into that, because that is a big topic, Luke, for those individuals that may not be aware of you and SapienX, and certainly the successful PXExpresso event you hosted this year, tell us a little bit more about what SapienX has been established to do. What are you looking to achieve through SapienX?
Basically, I want to keep everything the same. I want to reinforce all of the HR traditions that have got us to this point, and that's us done for today. So
yeah,
same time,
okay.
same time next week.
Yeah, nice one. Let's punch pause, folks.
No, of course. So the complete opposite of that. So SapienX was born out of my desire to improve the way in which we experience work. Let's sort of cut down to first principles. That's what I set out to do. I'm a former head of people myself. I joke and say that I'm a head of people in recovery, because it can feel that way sometimes. It's a tough old gig, particularly being the first head of people in a startup scale up where it's greenfield and there's so much expectation, but also so much misconception about HR and what you are there to do. So SapienX as a platform is content, so my newsletter, my podcast, courses. So I've my people first product led course, which is helping people leaders adopt this more product led approach to PX and HR, and then community. So a growing Slack community of progressive PX product builders, and as you alluded to, Glenn, most recently events, so live events with PXExpresso Live, the inaugural event happening in September just gone. So all of that is to drive this change. It's to celebrate innovation. It's to encourage HR to look outside of HR for inspiration and better ways to think and better ways to work, to deliver more impact and more value, and ultimately deliver on that idea of creating and designing a better experience of work for everyone.
Okay. Well, as I said at the top of in the green room, I'm here on the side of HR today, in so much as, when we go back to the Ulrich model and we think about how well kind of established HR is as a kind of function, as a kind of frameworks, processes, it's, something that companies rely on. It's a core central pillar in all scaling and established businesses. And, it serves the people. It does what it says on the tin. It's kind of, I guess, as a kind of almost opener, why would there need to be a different approach to HR? What would we potentially gain from that?
Just because something works doesn't mean it's the correct solution, or doesn't mean it's optimal. And so, look, I I give Ulrich a bit of a bashing every time, every time we speak about this, and it's not about Ulrich, right? So, Dave Ulrich did innovate, and he continues to contribute to that conversation. But the Ulrich model is more akin to a procurement model. So it's optimizing for resource acquisition and utilization and optimization from more of a procurement mindset, right? Which is fine. It's highly effective, highly efficient, and it does scale because you can standardize and you can automate and you can optimize for predictable, repeatable activities when you boil people down to numbers on a spreadsheet. I had a fabulous conversation with Dart Lindsley about this very topic recently, and I highly recommend listeners to go and check out Dart and his HBR article, Work as a Product. It's reimagining work as a product. But it's the same idea. Like, it's just because the Ulrich model is very efficient at delivering service and scaling with a business doesn't mean it's optimal from a people experience perspective. So that's really the shift. It's like, okay, if we're going to continue to scale our businesses where employees and the people that are delivering the most value are considered resources to be optimized, we're going to constantly run into challenges and problems with the experience of work, and we're never really going to reach true levels of engagement and performance and opportunity creation and all of the things that come with inclusive and intentional design. We're never going to get there. So that's I guess the opening argument, Glenn, I guess.
Matthias.
Okay, I love to switch to efficiency versus experience. I do think that is really, really important. I see this also going on in the TA space, right? So many times we focus on transactional KPIs, but they did not really create value, and then we wondered why they got laid off because they did not create value, right? So a question here would be, I've been thinking that, you see these conversations around talent density, performance cultures, right? And how does that for a company or for a startup relate to a great experience? Because most of the time that would mean that, people are pushed to the boundaries. They are not yet efficient. What is performance these days? What is productivity? People have no clue and then go to HR in the best case, without doing it themselves, to say, look, can you help us to create such a performance culture? And is actually HR capable, or people practices capable, to be a partner here to design such practices?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And your closing line there is the most critical, to design such practices. So modern HR, PX functions, people experience functions, have design at the center, right? So they're design functions. They're not service and administrative functions. They're design functions, and that's a key distinction. So it's a perfect question to ask. So yes, there is this default to turn to HR or whatever people functions in place to help address performance and cultural change. The problem that the traditional HR functions run into is because they end up designing poorly solutions that make sense in a HR roundtable, but don't make sense in reality and relative to the end users that they're meant to serve and meant to service. So that's the main difference here, is that, okay, if we flip that and go, well, how do we actually enable those closest to the problem to solve the problem? And that then changes everything about how you think and work in HR, because it's no longer what's the most optimizable standard process that we could implement that solves this problem on paper, versus how do we actually get to the first principles, root causes of the challenges that we're trying to solve, and how do we enable those closest to it to solve that problem with the support of HR and as the designers, not as the designers, builders, administrators, and deliverers, because that often happens in HR. And there's a great design principle that Jessica Swan advocates, which is achieve everything through others. And at the heart of that is breaking this broken approach from HR to build so many processes and tools that HR is responsible for delivering and administrating. And it's about how do we actually build for the end users that are going to use them so that they can maintain them, use them.
Maybe, Glenn, you want to?
Let's go.
Oh, here we go. Follow-up question on this, because I do think, I totally agree. I think especially topics like around co-creation, right? So really working with the business together to build these processes in order to also create input and buy-in, right, and commitment to, hey, this is done for you, is definitely a good one. I'm just wondering that when we like, let's say we at performance culture or performance management or performance reviews, right? If we open our LinkedIn box or a bubble there, everybody hates it. You cannot literally create a high satisfaction or experience with people because it's something that they might say, oh, this puts me in danger, or we have never had a performance culture or performance review before. What is in there for me? And so with everything you said, how can you make this an experience? Because this is never fun, right? For everyone, including. It starts with leaders who spend lots of time to do this, and then they be like, oh, I want this done in 30 minutes. Well, it never is done in 30 minutes because it's a complex thing, right? Then the people are like, why, what's in for me? Because literally, if this means they do this because they want to get rid of me, then this is also a threatening experience. So why would I participate in this? And then even in the conversations, you might say, look, but honestly, what you are holding me against or what your expectations are so far away from the reality that we do work. So how do you make this an experience-driven process?
Yeah, no, excellent question. And it comes down to exactly the heart of this echo chamber conversation is that often those performance management processes are created in silo, and then it's enforced upon frontline managers to do that process. Like, this is the process you must follow to do performance management. It's been designed for you, off you go. And it becomes this tick box exercise that everybody hates. Managers don't like doing it because they feel uncomfortable. It's a drain on their time. It's not high value. Employees hate doing it because there's a lot of fear and uncertainty around it. Often they're far too infrequent, and so those performance conversations are not happening often enough. So you get to those milestone quarterly, half year, annual conversations, and there's too much to unpack, and everything's too far away from the source. It's just a mess. So it's definitely going back to human-centered design in the sense of who are the end users of this. And there are multiple end users of a performance management process. So there's the employees who are going through that as the employee. Then you've got the line managers who are delivering it as that point of contact and executing on the performance management process. You've got the wider stakeholders in business and what they need from performance more broadly, and what does it mean to them. So you've got all these different users, but the primary users are going to be your employees and your line managers. So the process needs to be designed for and with them in mind, and it needs to be something that is culturally and contextually specific to the business and the individuals. So human-centered design is grounded in culture and context first. So really understanding end users and not just who they are and what they need to get out of that situation, and what is the value exchange that's happening during that performance management process, but also crucially, what's the context under which that is happening, business and local. So these are crucial. And again, it speaks to the heart of this problem, because we need to break down the HR silos of building behind closed doors and then pushing on the business, and we should get much closer to the end user and ask a lot more questions about why do we need a performance management process? Let's start there. Why do we even need one? And so, because some companies don't actually, as weird as that sounds, if they've had the type of culture that has feedback ingrained, like high quality feedback ingrained at every level of that employee experience, those performance management review processes actually become quite clunky and redundant because the ongoing performance conversations supersede. But why are we having them? Who are they for? And once we know those, how do we design them optimally to deliver value to all users?
Okay, that's interesting. There's a couple of pieces I want to pick out of both what you both said there, which is I kind of respect the fact that getting closer to the end user is a valuable thing. My challenge to you would be co-creation adds more time, and co-creation will depend on a degree of understanding, capability, knowledge, experience. So if, case in point, I'm head of HR, I want to co-create something with hiring managers around performance management. 50% of those hiring managers or those leaders are new to their position. So therefore there's perhaps a knowledge gap, experience gap. So actually co-creation then becomes part knowledge share and creation, which adds more time. I'm a head of HR. I've got the C-suite saying we need a performance management framework by the end of the quarter. I immediately see co-creation as a barrier, not an enabler. What's your take on that?
Well, it's a fair observation in that it probably will take more time up front because you're going to have to do that user research. You're going to have to understand the problem and the end users, and you're going to have to have those co-creation conversations to find the optimal solution. Yes, it will take a bit longer. So not contesting that, but the end product is going to be much higher quality and it will deliver more value over a longer period of time. So that's the initial counter to that. The other part of your challenge is an interesting one because it's so common. You said, the C-suite have demanded that we need this by X date. And so many traditional HR functions go, well, we've been told to deliver it, so we must deliver it, which inevitably leads to a fast-track solution that isn't going to be designed correctly because we want to please the C-suite who have asked that of us. In an ideal situation, and this is an echo chamber all of itself, like the seat at the table conversation, like ideally you want to be in a position where you're seen as a strategic leader and partner in that C-suite setup, and with that comes the ability and the confidence to push back and say, no, I know you're saying you want this by the end of the quarter. We're not going to deliver that. These are the reasons why, and this is why it's important to take this route and have those challenging conversations. Like we need more pushback from the HR community. We're far too agreeable, and I think that is a consequence of the type of profession, right? So we're drawn to this career field because we're naturally more inclined to focus on people needs and delivering value and pleasing people, like helping people. That's why we end up in a people profession. The kryptonite with that is that we tend to be higher in trait agreeableness, which means we don't often set the correct boundaries and push back when we should. So it's something we have to learn. So there's two parts to my response there. Learning the skill of pushing back and challenging requests upon us because we're not there as a function that delivers and services and administers. We're there as a strategic function that designs and creates value. And then the other part is, it will take a little bit longer, but it will be so much more worth that time in the long run.
It leads neatly to my next thought around how to reframe HR in the minds of the C-suite and leadership, because ultimately that the kind of reframing of kind of HR in the minds of leadership could work in a kind of startup scale up because it's early. In a really well established kind of corporate business like a bank or pharmaceutical company or something like that, where HR has always been HR, this is the HR model. Do you have some, and I don't think there's a kind of silver bullet for this particular thing, but do you have some advice for HR leaders in that type of scenario, how they can start to reframe HR in the minds of the leadership team, whether it's through projects, actions, conversation, signaling, whatever? How would you start that process?
Well, it's interesting that you referenced bank because I had a chat with one of the people team from Nubank just last week. So they're doing a really cool project at the moment to transition to a product-led approach to HR and PX across the business. So they've now got, I think Vito was saying that the plan is by the end of next year they'll have 16 different product managers in the people experience team, and they're making a big shift. And they've obviously, I think like 3 or 4,000 headcount. Like they're decent size. I think there's like 200 or 300 in the HR function. Like they're a big size. So they're about to go through this. So maybe at some point we come back and case study the success of that. But to answer your question more directly, like I think it is an easier sell in startups and scale-ups because the language and the stage is similar. There's more of like a product language fit, to use that phrase. We're talking about growth, we're talking about sprint, we're talking about understanding our end users and designing for end users and getting fit there. So that the language crossover, and there's less complexity because there's been less layers of process that are stacked on top of each other and less HR and people debt that have been accumulated. So it's definitely easier at startup and scale up to start the conversation. But in terms of the crux of what we're talking about here, we need to be able to communicate at any level that HR is not an administrative and support function. So I talk about the post-HR generation actually is a mindset shift. It's not one new way of working. I'm an advocate for product-led. It doesn't have to be that, but what we do need to be is value creating. And so that's the part to communicate. It's moving from support to strategy. Like, we're a strategic function, we're not a support function. It's moving from administration type activities to enablement type activities. It's moving ultimately from a function of stasis and maintenance to a function of growth. These are the key things to communicate and to push back on at any level, at any size organization, whatever you call HR, wherever you're at. These are the things to start to challenge. If you feel like you and your team are just being asked to service, then maybe have a think about how do we push back and challenge some of this, and how do we start to communicate value creation. And a lot of that comes from learning the language of the business and not using HR language that doesn't make sense and doesn't actually resonate or mean anything to anyone. And again, Jesse Swan speaks brilliantly about this. It's like you really need to be able to speak to a financial director in their language, a CFO in their language, a CEO in their language, a head of sales, go to market in their language. Like, how do you communicate the work that you're doing from a HR people function to relatable metrics within those other functions, so that you can help them understand that what you're doing there is driving value? So that's the heart of it. Value creation has to be what we do from people functions, not service and administer.
Look, totally agree on this. Now, let's say everything that you just described is about the people in the people function. Yeah. So that means the status quo is, or going back to the echo chamber, it is not about rethinking HR practices or people practices, actually upskilling the people leader or the people in that space in order to get to that stage to move from supportive to strategic. Mm-hmm. How much hope do you have there?
Massive amount, actually. I'm seeing it every day as a consequence of the work that I'm doing, that people are making this shift. And the fact that a company of the size of Nubank is pushing this forward. Canva, another one, actually. They've I spoke to Hugo who's just recently moved from their actual product team to their PX team as their first dedicated product manager. So like we're seeing it adopted at well-known brands and bigger organizations, but actually it's on the ground actually that I'm most excited about, because I work with so many early stage startup scale-ups that no one's heard of yet, that are doing really cool progressive things. I'll pick out Frida Mocker as an example of this, head of people and culture at Sastrify. She's just got the most tenacious bias for action that I've come across, and since when she started wanting to shift into this people product-led people approach, I've kind of been there on her shoulder all the way, which has been really cool to see. And someone like her communicates the value and the work really well. So we need it. We need a groundswell of people. There's over 500 in my closed community now that are actively like doing this work. My followership gives me great hope, to speak to your question. But I think hope and optimism, I'm naturally going to be that way because I'm in the space, right? So we actually need to find some way of measuring sentiment from those outside of the function and outside of the progressive function. So that's a different question altogether. But within the function, I'm seeing a real appetite for change and a real desire to shift not only the perception but also the value that HR creates. So I'm very optimistic. On optimism, I'm what I think I want to remember who it was. I think Peter Thiel possibly. I know that some people have mixed views on him as a thinker and as a person, but he talked in 0 to 1 about the different levels of optimism and pessimism. I definitely fall on the intentional optimist scale, which is the future will be positive because I will make it so. And I think we need more of that, not just blind optimism, infinite optimism, which is everything is going to change and it'll be brilliant. It's like, no, things will change because we'll take personal accountability as individuals to make that change happen. Without that bit, the whole thing falls apart. So my call to action is always personal accountability from HR. And if you and your function aren't adding value, there's no one else to blame but you. And that's a hard truth to swallow. So the change has to start with the individual leaders in our profession.
Okay, I'm going to come out swinging now. HR has CIPD, widely recognised, and something that if you're an early stage startup or early stage kind of founder, you'll see CIPD, HR. There's an assurance that comes with that. The post-HR generation, do they have something similar to that? Do they have something that has that kind of that foundational, instantly recognised kind of either certification, educational kind of level knowledge? It's what I'm trying to say is immediately people think safety.
Mm-hmm.
So I thinking about the post-HR generation, how am I going to feel safe?
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. And what CIPD has been good at for many decades now is process, policy, legal, the drier side of the coin when it comes to HR, which is still absolutely necessary. But here's the truth, right? It's common sense. It really is. Particularly, I haven't done CIPD. I explored it when I was ahead of people. I thought, because everyone was saying, well, you should have CIPD, I had a look at it. I was like, this is going to add zero value. I'm not doing that. I'm not spending that amount of money and time doing something that is going to reinforce things that I intuitively know to be true. I know that sounds a bit like cavalier, but if you are a common sense kind of person, it doesn't take a lot to navigate and mitigate some of those, legal and HR compliance elements. Now, you can't get by on that alone, but what you can do is very quickly now access communities that will share policies, open source policies, open source, everything's open source now. You can, like, the open source library from the OpenOrg crew is just amazing. So there's always access to people, community, things, resources that can plug a gap that you don't have. I wouldn't rely solely on these, but what was really useful for me actually was, as a first-time head of people without a CIPD, I found that 99% of my instincts were correct, but I always did speak with an external HR consultant on the big things. So you can always do that, and you can get a sense check and verification on what you're planning to do and what your sense is. So there's so many functions that allow you to tap into those parts that you then just accumulate over time. It's like any job, like you're best to learn on the job, but there's some things you can't. In HR, there's some things you can't risk, right? So you can't be too cavalier on certain things, but there's so many resources for you to lean into when you need them. It's like the whole learning approach to learning in the modern world is moving towards just-in-time learning. Like the example I always give is actually an old L&D colleague. Do you remember Jeremy? Glenn?
Yeah, I remember Jeremy Snell.
Jeremy, who was head of L&D at Hudson. He shared with me this analogy of if you want to make a lasagna, what you do is you go onto Google and you say, how do you make a lasagna? And you've got videos, you've got tutorials, you've got articles, you've got recipes. You can even like buy your ingredients right from there. Like it's all there for you, but you do that when you need to know it. What you're not likely to do is to go on a course 2 years before that about how to make a lasagna, just in case you need to make a lasagna. Because not only will you have forgotten most of that stuff, it's probably outdated and irrelevant, and it's not going to be there when you need it, and you're probably still going to have to go back. So listen, I don't think CIPD is without value. I want to be clear on that. I think it can be highly useful, and particularly if you're the type of person that is more interested in the compliance side of HR and the policy and process side of HR, it's got huge relevance, but it's not necessary. And I think most of that stuff can be learned on the job. What's more difficult is the mindset that allows you to be growth oriented and focus on the other things is a lot harder to come by.
You two keep talking for a second. This is a pause moment. Somebody's fucking smashing on my door. Hang on.
Oh, Jesus.
Oh, okay. Luke, while Glenn is fixing his urgent request, as it seems, look, I love this. We talked about the practices. We talked about the people who actually also need to change a bit more in order to make that switch from supportive to strategic. Now, what do you think? Do people have the appetite now? Talking only about our stakeholders, executives, the business leaders that we work for or work with, maybe, not work for, but work with. Do they also have the appetite to see HR changing to become more strategic and not just supportive or customer centric in that sense? Because I sometimes see that executives in this world, they love a proper, like, oh, there's a process and they deliver contracts and this is predictable. We had this question with Sunita on the last episode, like, this is something they can control over and they have some numbers on and this is good. But the strategic part takes away some control that they currently have on steering the company. So how ready are they?
Yeah, and I also want to go back and caveat on the whole CIPD part of that conversation before, in the sense that, whilst I was a bit cavalier and jovial and tongue-in-cheek about, the lasagna analogy and just in time, all that's fine. But, there's great comfort and a need in having those compliance, legal, employment law, all of those elements. Like, you do not want to be playing around with those. So from like an executive perspective, you're going to want to make sure and know, you're going to want to have confidence that before your people team is out there playing product management, that those elements are taken care of. I was being trivial before, deliberately so, but you need that confidence. So there's two ways to approach that. There's making sure that you have a team. Let's say I'm an advocate for T-shaped teams, so you might have someone in your team that is, their vertical is on that side of the HR coin, that is very focused on compliance, policy, process to make sure that that's covered. And you might then spread skills across your business in other verticals of design, of those sorts of things. That's one way. Like, how do you actually construct your team? Because if you only hire people with verticals in compliance, admin, that's all you're capable of doing as a function. So I think it's more about thinking carefully about how you put your team together based on the value you want to create. The other side is, why does that part, this is maybe more controversial, why does that part of the business even have to sit with the people team? Because it's actually closer to legal than it is people experience anyway. And obviously that doesn't mean that you ignore the design side, because you still need to design how people interact with that compliance side of the business as employees effectively and well to optimize experience. But does it have to be does it even have to be the core role of HR? And that's a little bit more controversial. Or should it be something that sits, like I say, closer to legal and ops, and then people function is focused on, well, we have a 60 to 70% of our annual cost is on our headcount. And so we should have a function whose sole responsibility is optimizing that headcount to deliver value. Like that should be, and when I say optimize, deliver value, we're not talking the procurement sense like we spoke about before. We're talking about how do we actually build, engineer, design a people experience which allows people to maximally succeed, maximally achieve, maximally perform, maximally excel, all of these things. And all of that then is aligned to, crucially, the top organizational priorities. What are we trying to achieve as a business, and how do we align our people growth objectives to those objectives of the business? And that's the role now of the people function, is strategic, is growth oriented, and it is about optimizing the overall performance of the business. And a lot of that comes through culture, a lot of that comes through process, but it's the way that those experiences are designed, and the focus of the people team shifting from we're only here to do the IPD HR versus we can do that and we do that well, but we deliver all of this value too.
Yeah.
Do we need fundamental change, or can we not just add another pillar to the kind of HR framework? So you've kind of sort of talked about kind of legal compliance, and then we had the administrative, we had payroll, that sort of thing. And then we're talking about kind of like, I guess, pay compensation. And now we're just adding another pillar of kind of something that looks to optimize the kind of people experience of all of those different pillars. Or are you still advocating for genuine kind of transformational change within HR? Because the easy step for traditional HR would be, let's just add that additional pillar and start to integrate that across our existing kind of framework.
I wouldn't say it's like the worst thing to do, but it's probably not optimal. What I'm advocating for is more of a wholesale change to how we think and work in the profession. But as a starting point, I don't think it's a bad idea to say, okay, we'll leave the core HR infrastructure as it is because it's well established in our business. Even if it's not driving a lot of value, it's well established, it's serving a function, it's trusted. What we could then do is, why don't we create a PX growth team, or even an individual that sits alongside that, which then is someone, and it could be a combination of people that you already have based on that sort of T-shaped idea. But why don't we have a separate function then, if that's the case, that is focused on understanding, doing that user research internally on our employee user base, identifying areas of highest impact potential for development, and doing early experiments to validate need and requirement, which can then be pushed into production. So I don't think it's a bad idea at all to have a specific function that's dedicated on growth-based activities. In my view, that should be 90% of what a people function does, not 10%. But if you start with 10%, fine. At least it's something, and it will help start shift the dial. But to answer your question directly, I am advocating for more of a wholesale shift in how we think and work in HR. And I genuinely think that a lot of the work that is pushed onto HR teams can easily be serviced by other functions and departments in the business, and which would free up a lot more time to focus on the growth-based activities.
What would you say if, like, an executive team says, look, they are so not fed up. Let's say they are happy with the team, what they have, and it's very service oriented, very operational heavy. And all of the executives say, well, building engagement, driving culture is something that I do as an executive in my area of business. Why would I now get a fancy people team that kind of wants to mess with this and takes this away from me?
My response would be, we're definitely not trying to mess with that and take it away from you. We're trying to enable you to deliver it much more effectively. So it's definitely, it should never be the case that the people or HR team are the guardians of culture. That should never be the case. But we are the teams that are closest to the ground. We should have the best level of insight into people sentiment across the business. We should be able to be best positioned to influence change, influence solutions, identify frustrations, bottlenecks. We're in the best seat in the house for that, and that's the bit we should optimize for, is understanding the business and then working with managers, execs, front lines to develop localized solutions to address that. Now, for me, this all comes back to this siloed approach. We're still thinking in silos. Like, how does that silo over there affect this silo over there? That affects that silo over there, and that's the bit that we need to work on. So when I map and model the full people experience subscription product, as I would describe it, so that was a great light bulb moment for me. I was thinking in products terms for a long time, but it was Jesse's book, Built for People, that introduced the idea of a subscription product, which is much more accurate. It's how do we actually connect the dots end to end? Like, how are we thinking about this employee lifecycle as a subscription product, which has all the same touch points that you would have on a customer journey engaging with any other subscription-based product, and the best subscription products actually do an amazing job of building, maintaining, continuing and increasing value and engagement. Otherwise, you're going to be lost. You're going to churn. And so it's that same idea. It's like, this isn't just singular things. It's not singular initiatives that address singular issues. It's like, what is the connection here? It's end-to-end people experience subscription cycle that we are designing for, which means, going back to earlier, a lot more co-creation, because the HR team aren't best positioned to solutionize often, but they are best positioned to understand the problems that, or at least to understand the sentiment around challenges that exist in the business.
I've got a context here in so much as and so this is me warming towards the post-HR generation, right? I think when we think about, like I say, the Ulrich model, we think about the number of generations that are actually in the workforce then, comparative to now. So when you start to sort of talk about kind of HR servicing the workforce, you're talking about 3-4 generations, very different generations in the workforce now that want different experiences, have different demands, have different expectations about work, the work environment, what's on offer to them and what's important to them. So case in point, at the kind of top end there, you've kind of got, the sort of Gen X's and kind of what I call late millennial or earlier millennials who are very much around, okay, these are the types of benefits I'm looking for in terms of, and the type of work environment I'm looking for, comparative to kind of Gen Z, and then, equally following very quickly, I would imagine, it kind of Gen Alpha. You're designing for different generations now. So actually, the one-size-fits-all HR people framework no longer fits everybody. It may only service one generation or two generations. So actually starting to think in the context of multi-generational, in the context of somebody subscribing to a product that they want, actually there's net benefits in that, right?
Definitely.
Do you see that as a drive? So case in point, if we resist the post-HR generation and we resist, people first, product led, as is with all things in technology change and people change, it's going to happen anyway. You're going to be forced by, the people in the business to adopt that. So actually, it's almost like adopt it now and move forward with it and start to co-create, or it will happen anyway. There's an inevitability about it, perhaps.
I hope there is. The very nature of product-led anything is that the direction that you take that product is informed by the end user and how they want it to look and feel for them. Like Slack's a great example, isn't it? It took them, was it 15, I might be getting the numbers wrong. I think it took them over a decade to establish product market fit because they were building for a different solution and they realized that users were using it in a very different way. So then they shifted the solution to fit around them. It's a great example of product-led so that's at the heart of it. So we can't have this fixed idea of what the work experience is. It has to be led by those that are experiencing it and what they want from it. There's a duality here because also the business needs and expects a return on investment, right? If they're paying your salary, then you are agreeing to exchange your skills and your productivity to create value for the business, but that's not the end of the story. So again, Dart talks about this brilliantly. So again, I'd refer everyone back to Dart Lindsley on this, but Dart talks about the jobs to be done framework and its application relative to our experience of work, because jobs to be done, part of that is that we hire our jobs to do things for us too, and that's going to be the bit that's most subjective. So, and particularly when you talk about generational, we've seen it in the current generations that are much more sort of outwardly purpose driven, and they take a lot more, they pay a lot more attention to that, and that's part of what they're expecting. Many of them, not all, generalizing here, but that is a big difference. Like, it's no, our parents, let's say my parents, it was much more about a salary, a security, and a means to an end than it is today. There's a lot more choice, there's a lot more expectation from the employee base, but it is going to vary from generation to generation, from individual to individual. But that doesn't mean, I just want to be really clear here, that doesn't mean that you're designing 4,000 different employee experiences, but you're identifying personas within those groups that you design for, like you would with any product. Like, what are the main personas that exist? And within those personas, who are the worst affected users? And then designing for the worst affected users in those persona groups, because by doing that, you're going to create a better experience for all those in that persona group, right? So there's these product and design approaches that we need to get good at using, but that jobs to be done framework is an excellent one to speak to what you're talking about. Like, it's not a singular idea, and each of us will hire our work to do different things for us.
Question to both of you. We are very much in this product terminologies now. Let's stay there for 1 second and say, Luke, challenging you here, product-led growth, isn't that? And isn't it more like about product-led sales? Like, for example, what you are arguing quite a lot is that you say, well, I built the best product for the different personas and therefore I drive growth. What about if that is not working out and you need to sell more product because it does not lead to growth in that regard? Because let's say, exaggerating here, I built the best product, but at the same time, because I built the best product for a key persona, I get unfair to other personas in the organization. For example, I don't have equal standards, no consistency, no fair performance processes, different hiring processes, because we are just so obsessed in creating products or experiences for certain personas that actually I am in a culture, let's say, in a culture that is less mature. I need to sell what my product can actually do much more than an organization that completely understands, hey, I design a product and that's why I grow, because that is what I need. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think there we need to also be mindful about, you mentioned context, you mentioned maturity. We are talking also with people here that maybe come from enterprises, that maybe come from start and scale ups. And I think, what I see more and more happening is that we have those change momentums, right? We are screwed because certain companies don't work any further because they missed out on digital transformation and now they need to change their whole organization, whole culture. They're missing key skills in the market that they need to adjust and transition into in order to still stay alive and relevant in the next couple of years now. So I try to understand this piece a bit more and love to explore it with you.
Yeah, so you're right. Like, you can't be in a position where you're trying to create a hyper-personalized experience for individuals, even two smaller subsets. You can't do that. So, and you also have to remember that the people experience product, the work product, isn't just a product for employees. Mm-hmm. So almost primarily, and this might be controversial, almost primarily it's a product for the business at large, right? That's the exec, the board. We have to remember that Businesses are, but I could say 99% of businesses are born out of capitalism to some degree, because that's just the nature of it, which means you're trying to grow, you're trying to build something, you're trying to drive commercial success or deliver some meaningful impact to end users of some kind that is based on the ability to utilize people's skills, time, resources, productivity to deliver that. And so we have to remember that, this is at least a two-sided product. So we have to remember that we're not just focusing on what do employees need, because if you do that, and again, what's the quote from Ford? If we asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for quicker horses, right? So you do have to be very careful about being led by employee expectations, wants, needs. It's not about that. It's about understanding the needs of the organization first. Like, as controversial as that sometimes sounds to HR people, the business actually is the primary objective here, because if we're going to create a sustainable business, a healthy business, then we need to understand its objectives and how do we build our people experience product aligned to that. And that comes down to once you're doing that bit right, your hiring practices. This is why it's not a singular thing. Can't be siloed, right? You have to hire the right people that are going to get the right exchange from the work product that you can provide to them, and that are going to deliver the right value exchange to the business and what they need to get out of that relationship. So it's multi-sided. At the very least, it's two-sided, but it's a multi-sided product.
Cool. I think it's interesting point you make around almost the kind of exchange of value, because I don't think that's immediately recognized and seen in that kind of employer-employee dynamic. Do you think that's more a mindset shift for the leadership team and leaders of the business as opposed to perhaps the employees? In so much as typically an employee would be seen as in service to the business. That kind of mutual exchange of value perhaps is something that, I don't know, maybe is a narrative that's been born out of kind of COVID times where, we've been working from home, people are starting to think about choice, what is important to them. Do you, just as a kind of high level, do you see that might be more of a mindset shift for leadership to understand exchange of value, and thereby it's easier then to understand why kind of people-led, kind of product first, or people first, product-led is a more of a natural next step.
A good exchange, in a good deal, no one loses. So that's kind of the approach. Like if there's a one-sided deal where the business wins and the employees lose, it's not a good deal. In the same way that if the employees win and the business loses, it's not a good deal. So it's understanding what is the value exchange that's happening to all parties involved, and is everyone getting a good deal? And that's critical. So that's kind of the mindset shift that we need to take. And also, if we are seeing work as a product, that means that by default, our potential buyers of that product have choice. They are in a market where they then can choose an alternative work product that does deliver the value exchange that they're looking for, with the caveat that we are talking about the developed West when we're having this conversation, and work in other areas of the world is a very different type of exchange, driven by different motivations and different objectives and mindsets. But if we're talking about the developed West, certainly we have choice, and so we have to remember that. If it's a one-sided deal, they're only going to stay for the shortest amount of time possible, and then they'll go somewhere else where they can find a better value exchange. And the same has to be brutally true the other way around. If the employee is extracting value and not delivering any in return, business by rights could terminate that, because it's not a good value exchange. And this is the other part that a lot of HR traditions don't like to talk about. Like, our job is to make those, at least be part of making those decisions and enable those decisions to happen more quickly, but crucially in a way that is done with compassion, right? It doesn't have to be a brutal thing, but if the value exchange is off on either side, a correction needs to be made.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, that's really good.
That's almost the summary right there, because I think you've encapsulated for me probably the most kind of human emotive element, which is value exchange and choice. And if that's the fundamental kind of drivers for the sort of people, talent, HR function, we need to lead and lean into that. It's like, is this a fair exchange of value?
Yeah.
Is there choice in there for everybody? And that comes back to that kind of almost focus on the sort of human-centered design. It's putting people at the center. Matthias, closing thoughts before we hand over to Luke for his closing statement on the echo chamber?
No, I really liked I like the conversation as a whole, but really also the last piece of it, right? I think it's very important that we, per default, as people always go into, we have the needs of the employees, and if we serve them, then everything is okay or good, right? And then we go into this people-pleasing mechanism that is also very unhealthy and very toxic to a certain extent. So I love this approach of saying, look, we have different stakeholders most of the time, only like doing satisfaction surveys sometimes to make people happy, and you'd be like, but look, they enjoyed the training or they enjoyed the hiring process. I sometimes say, like, if you satisfy hiring managers, you clearly made something wrong, to my recruiters. But no offense to the hiring managers, I'm saying, like, what is your key stakeholder? And the key stakeholder in that sense is the business, the company that you provide value with, while then it's important that they get a return on investment that makes sense. But I also love this both-sided value topic. For me, it's like, if the company grows, then people will grow. And if this is a win-win situation that we create and a learning opportunity for both, then this is always the key ingredient to drive success for building companies all together. And you may have said it in a different way, but I love this approach, because I do think that is really, really important to keep that balance, and not just please people on the one side and ruin businesses on the other.
100%. So kind of close out if we say the echo chamber is HR is fine and is progressing okay as it is, what's the need to kind of consider the post HR generation? Just as an opener, think of this as an opening conversation of somebody. You've just met them, you're networking at an event, they're head of HR, they're like, hey, look, I've heard about this post-HR generation, but listen, I think HR's fine, we're progressing quite nicely, there's some kind of trends and stuff that we're looking at in 2025. How do you just kind of open that conversation from your perspective?
I think I'll probably just sort of summarize the last maybe 10 minutes of the conversation, and I would say, because the job of HR should be to generate value, and at the moment it doesn't. And if it does, it shifts value to one side or the other, and it fails to address the two-sided product dynamic that's at play. So it would be to emphasize the point that if everyone agrees, if everyone's okay to conceptually agree that this idea that work is a product, people have choice, which means we have to make a product that is creating value for that customer end user on both sides of the two-sided product dynamic. So generate and grow value for the business and generate value and grow the employee. And that is a successful, sustainable work product.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we escape the echo chamber.
Boom.
Luke, you've been amazing. This has been thoroughly enjoyable. Matthias, as ever, awesome, man. I've loved this conversation. I've loved playing devil's advocate on this one as well, but I've loved this conversation.
Likewise.
Closing thoughts, Matthias?
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, look, it's really good, and it's something that sometimes they keep my head spinning around. Is it practices? Is it people? Is it stakeholder? Like, who is it? Why is it the way it is? And how do you make this happen? But I think we also sometimes overthink a lot of things, and that hinders us from executing and trying and experimenting. And One element that we haven't talked about or just briefly touched upon, which I'm a high believer on, is iterations, right? So if you do a first round of performance reviews, you iterate again, and then you iterate again, and then you iterate again. We have a skill-based organization in my business, part of the business, and how we work with the taxonomy that we have in place. It's through every hire, through every review, we iterate, we combine, we look at this, we survey this, we try to figure this out. We want to make it as seamless as possible because we know that whenever we do it, we're not 100% pixel perfect fine, right? And there are so many different voices in an environment. And so it's part of the progress of evolvement to also make it 80% fit and then start getting to 100, right?
100%.
Yeah. I think I won't drag us into another long conversation, but maybe we do a return on that. But yeah, just to build on that and just to close on that, like the constant beta mindset is something that is really important to adopt as well in people in HR teams, because I think there's too much of a finite view and a final view. Like it's either done or it's not done. Which is never the case. Like, and to your point, it's to deliver more value more frequently. We have to be comfortable that 60, 70, 80% is fine as long as it allows us to learn more about what's going to make it a better and then improve on a series of iterations. So couldn't agree more, Matthias, on that point.
Amazing. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on Escaping the Echo Chamber. Matthias, thank you as ever for being an incredible co-host. Luca Marni, thank you so much for being our guest. We'll be dropping all your links in the social. Big shout out to PXExpresso 2025. There'll be more news coming from that. And I think just a massive thank you to everybody who's kind of tuning in so far. We're getting some good viewership and stuff like that. And I really believe that, through these conversations, we are escaping that echo chamber, challenging the kind of norms and the narratives in the people and talent space. And I think that's incredibly valuable for everybody. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and thank you once again, Luke, for being our guest.
Absolute
Thank you
pleasure.
so much, Luke.
Thanks everybody. Cheers.
Ciao.